actions were always betrayed by somebody. They had no mountain passes to defend like the Maroons in Jamaica, no impenetrable swamps like the Maroons in Surinam. Where they had these, even on a small scale, they had used them, as in certain swamps around Savannah and in the Everglades of Florida, where they united with the Indians and would stand fire, so I was told by General Saxton, who had fought them there, when the Indians would retreat. It always seemed to me that had I been a slave, my life would have been one long scheme of insurrection. But I learned to respect the patient self-control of those who had waited till the course of events should open a better way. When it came, they accepted it. Insurrection on their part would at once have divided the Northern sentiment, and a large part of our army would have joined with the Southern army to hunt them down. By their waiting till we needed them, their freedom was secured. Two things chiefly surprised me in their feeling towards their former masters: the absence of affection and the absence of revenge. I expected to find a good deal of the patriarchal feeling. It always seemed to me a very ill-applied emotion as connected with the facts and laws of American slavery. Still, I expected to find it. I suppose that my men and their families and visitors may have had as much of it as the mass of freed slaves, but certainly they had not a particle. I never could cajole one of them, in his most discontented moment, into regretting old master time for a single instant. I never heard one speak of the masters except as natural enemies. Yet they were perfectly discriminating as to individuals. Many of them claimed to have had very kind owners, and some expressed great gratitude to them for particular favors received. It was not the individuals, but the ownership of which they complained. That they saw to be wrong, which no special kindness could right. On this, as on all points connected with slavery, they understood the matter as clearly as Garrison or Phillips. The wisest philosophy could teach them nothing as to that, nor could any false philosophy befog them. After all, personal experience is the best logician. Certainly this indifference did not proceed from any want of personal affection, for they were the most affectionate people among whom I had ever lived. They attached themselves to every officer who deserved love, and to some who did not, and if they failed to show it to their masters, it proved the wrongfulness of the mastery. On the other hand, they rarely showed one gleam of revenge, and I shall never forget the self-control with which one of our best sergeants pointed out to me at Jacksonville the very place where one of his brothers had been hanged by the whites for leading a party of fugitive slaves. He spoke of it as a historical matter, without any bearing on the present issue. But side by side with this faculty of patience, there was a certain tropical element in the men, a sort of fiery ecstasy when aroused, which seemed to link them by blood to the French turcos, and made them really resemble their natural enemies, the Celts, far more than the Anglo-Saxon temperament. To balance this, there were great individual resources when alone, a sort of Indian wiliness and subtlety of resource. Their gregariousness and love of drill made them more easy to keep in hand than white American troops, who rather liked to straggle or to go in little squads, looking out for themselves, without being bothered with officers. The blacks prefer organization. The point of inferiority that I always feared, though I never had occasion to prove it, was that they might show less fibre, less tough and dogged resistance than whites during a prolonged trial, a long disastrous march, for instance, or the hopeless defence of a besieged town. I should not be afraid of their mutinying or running away, but of their drooping and dying. It might not turn out so, but I mention it for the sake of fairness, and to avoid overstating the merits of these troops. As to the simple general fact of courage and reliability, I think no officer in our camp ever thought of there being any difference between black and white, and certainly the opinions of these officers, who for years risked their lives every moment on the fidelity of their men, were worth more than those of all the world beside. No doubt there were reasons why this particular war was an especially favorable test for the colored soldiers. They had more to fight for than the whites. Besides the flag and the Union, they had home, wife, and child. They fought with ropes round their necks, and when the orders were issued that officers of colored troops should be put to death on capture, they took a grim satisfaction. It helped their esprit de corps immensely. With us, at least, there was to be no play soldier. Though they had begun with a slight feeling of inferiority to the white troops, this compliment substituted a peculiar sense of self-respect, and even when the new colored regiments began to arrive from the North, my men still pointed out this difference, that in case of ultimate defeat, the Northern troops, black or white, would go home, while the First South Carolina must fight it out or be re-enslaved. This was one thing that made the St. John's River so attractive to them, and even to me. It was so much nearer the Everglades. I used seriously to ponder, during the darker periods of the war, whether I might not end my days as an outlaw, a leader of Maroons. Meanwhile, I used to try and make some capital for the Northern troops, in their estimate, by pointing out that it was a disinterested thing in these men from the free States to come down here and fight, that the slaves might be free. But they were apt keenly to reply that many of the white soldiers disavowed this object, and said that it was not the object of the war, nor even likely to be its end. Some of them even repeated Mr. Seward's unfortunate words to Mr. Adams, which some general had been heard to quote. So on the whole I took nothing by the motion, as was apt to be the case with those who spoke a good word of our government in those vacillating and half pro-slavery days. At any rate, this ungenerous discouragement had this good effect, that it touched their pride. They would deserve justice, even if they did not obtain it. This pride was afterwards severely tested during the disgraceful period when the party of repudiation in Congress temporarily deprived them of their promised pay. In my regiment, the men never mutinied, nor even threatened to mutiny. They seemed to make it a matter of honor to do their part, even if the government proved a defaulter. But 1/3 of them, including the best men in the regiment, quietly refused to take $1's pay at the reduced price. "We's gib our soldiering to de government gunnel," they said, "but we won't splize ourselves so much to take de $7." They even made a contemptuous ballad, of which I once caught a snatch. $10 a month, tree ob dat for clothing, go to Washington, fight for Lincoln's daughter. This Lincoln's daughter stood for the goodness of liberty, it would seem. They would be true to her, but they would not take the half pay. This was contrary to my advice and that of their officers, but now I think it was wise. Nothing less than this would have called the attention of the American people to this outrageous fraud. The same slow forecast had often marked their action in other ways. One of our ablest sergeants, Henry McIntyre, who had earned $2.50 per day as a master carpenter in Florida, and paid $1.50 to his master, told me that he had deliberately refrained from learning to read, because that knowledge exposed the slaves to so much more watching and suspicion. This man and a few others had built on contract the greater part of the town of Micanopy in Florida, and was a thriving man when his accustomed discretion failed for once, and he lost all. He named his child William Lincoln, and it brought upon him such suspicion that he had to make his escape. I cannot conceive what people of the North mean by speaking of negroes as a bestial or brutal race. Except in some insensibility to animal pain, I never knew of an act in my regiment which I should call brutal. In reading Kay's Condition of the English Peasantry, I was constantly struck with the unlikeness of my men to those therein described. This could not proceed from my prejudices as an abolitionist, for they would have led me the other way, and indeed I had once written a little essay to show the brutalizing influences of slavery. I learned to think that we abolitionists had underrated the suffering produced by slavery among the negroes, but had overrated the demoralization. Or rather, we did not know how the religious temperament of the negroes had checked the demoralization. Yet again it must be admitted that this temperament, born of sorrow and oppression, is far more marked in the slave than in the native African. Theorize as we may, there was certainly in our camp an average tone of propriety, which visitors noticed, and which was not created, but only preserved by discipline. I was always struck not merely by the courtesy of the men, but also by a certain sober decency of language. If a man had to report to me any disagreeable fact, for instance, He was sure to do it with gravity and decorum, and not